You wake up before the sun, and the first thing your body asks for isn't food, it's relief. No hallway, no door to lock, no small tiled room waiting for you down the hall. For most of human history, the most private act of your day happened in public, in the open, in front of people who knew your name. That sounds impossible. It wasn't. For roughly 300,000 years, going to the bathroom was one of the least private things a human being ever did. Today, the average person in a wealthy country spends about 3 years of their life on the toilet, almost always alone, almost always behind a locked door. Your ancestors would have found that isolation strange, maybe even a little sad. Why would you want to be alone for something so ordinary? Let's rebuild what this actually looked like, not the sanitized version, the real one, stage by stage, backed by what archaeologists and scientists have actually pulled out of the ground. This is a long journey. It runs from open grassland to crowded mudbrick towns, through Bronze Age street drains, Roman stone benches, the bathhouses of the Islamic world, medieval cesspits, the exact London street where modern sanitation was born, and finally into the strange, quiet, thoroughly modern room you probably used this morning. Stay with it. The ending changes how you see that room completely. Start with the deep past, the Paleolithic, the hundreds of thousands of years before farming existed. Humans lived in small bands, usually 20 to 50 people, moving across open landscapes. There were no walls. There was no plumbing. There was, in the modern sense, no bathroom at all. So what did people do? They walked a short distance from camp. Not far, just far enough to be downwind, downhill, away from the sleeping area and the food. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, people like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San of the Kalahari, before those groups adopted modern sanitation, have documented exactly this pattern. A rough perimeter formed around camp. Inside it, life. Just outside it, waste. Everyone knew where the edge was. Nobody needed a sign. Here's the detail that surprises most people. There was very little shame attached to any of this. Shame around bodily functions is not some ancient universal instinct hardwired into every human brain. It's learned. It's cultural. Anthropologists have found wide variation across societies in how openly people discuss and perform these functions, and many small-scale societies show far less embarrassment than industrialized ones. Your ancestors weren't repressed. They were practical. Why does this matter? Because it tells you something uncomfortable about your own discomfort. The blush you feel, the instinct to whisper, the relief of a locked door, none of that is built into your biology. It was built into your culture, layer by layer, over thousands of years. You inherited an emotion, not a fact. Now here's where the evidence gets specific, because this isn't guesswork. This is a real field of science, and it has a name most people have never heard. It's called paleoparasitology. It's the study of ancient parasites preserved for thousands of years inside fossilized human waste, called coprolites. Yes, scientists study ancient poop for a living, and it turns out to be one of the richest sources of information we have about how early humans actually lived. Carl Reinhard, a paleoparasitologist who spent decades analyzing coprolites from archaeological sites across the Americas, has shown that these preserved samples can reveal exactly what people ate, what diseases they carried, and how they managed hygiene, or didn't. Reinhard's work has found parasite eggs, undigested seeds, tiny bone fragments, even traces of medicinal plants locked inside waste that is thousands of years old. A single sample can rebuild an entire week of someone's diet, sometimes even the season they lived in, based on which seeds and pollen show up. Skeletal and archaeological evidence confirms the wider picture. Researchers studying human waste from later, denser settlements, places where thousands of people lived close together for the first time in history, have found something striking. As populations grew and people stopped moving constantly, sanitation problems exploded. The open perimeter system that worked fine for 50 wandering people fell apart completely once you had a fixed town of 2,000. This brings us to one of the most important shifts in the entire story, and it's the same shift that changed almost everything else about human life: agriculture. Around 12,000 years ago, in scattered locations across the world, humans began to settle down. They built permanent homes. They stayed in one place for generations. And one of the very first problems this created wasn't food storage or property or war. It was waste. What do you do with human waste when you can't just walk away from it and let the camp move on? At Çatalhöyük, a remarkably well-preserved Neolithic settlement in what is now Turkey, archaeologists have spent decades excavating a town of roughly 8,000 people who lived in densely packed mud-brick houses with no streets between them. People entered their homes through holes in the roof. Excavations at the site have revealed rubbish and waste deposits built up in specific areas near and even within houses. Evidence of a community still working out, in real time, how to manage a completely new problem. There was no blueprint. Nobody had ever lived like this before. They were inventing sanitation from scratch. And the mess in the archaeological record shows exactly how messy that invention process actually was. So picture it. Picture a Çatalhöyük household 9,000 years ago. A woman climbs down a wooden ladder through a hole in her roof into a single dim room shared with her family, her stored grain, and the ash pit near the hearth. Waste from daily life gets pushed to designated corners or carried out and dumped nearby. The smell is part of daily existence, not a crisis, just a fact of living close together for the first time in the history of the species. She has never known anything else. Neither has anyone she knows. Now push forward a few thousand more years, because settlements kept growing, and so did the ambition of the solutions. In the Indus Valley, in cities like Mohenjo-daro, roughly 4,500 years ago, archaeologists have uncovered something startling for how early it is. Many homes had their own private latrines connected to covered drains running beneath the streets, carrying waste out of the city entirely. This is one of the earliest known examples of anything resembling a city-wide sewage system anywhere on Earth. Long before Rome, long before Greece, a Bronze Age city already trying to solve the exact same problem on Çatalhöyük never fully cracked. Doesn't that surprise you? That some of the very earliest large cities in human history were already engineering their way toward private plumbing, thousands of years before anyone had a word for hygiene. Now, compare that to what came later in the Roman world, because the fix, when it fully matured, was more sophisticated than most people expect, and also far stranger. By the time you reach the Roman Empire, roughly 2,000 years ago, some cities had genuinely impressive engineered sanitation. Public latrines with rows of stone seats, no partitions between them, water running underneath to carry waste away. People sat side by side, chatting, conducting business, in a room we would now consider almost unbearably public. Instead of toilet paper, Romans commonly used a tool called xylospongium, a sponge fixed to the end of a stick, which was rinsed in a channel of flowing water in front of the seats, and in many cases, shared between users. Take a second with that. Shared. In front of everyone. Casually. This is where Piers Mitchell's research becomes essential, because it answers the obvious question. Did all this engineering actually make people healthier? Mitchell, a researcher at the University of Cambridge who has extensively studied parasites in ancient latrines and cesspits across the Roman world, found something genuinely counterintuitive. Despite the impressive aqueducts, the public bathhouses, the sewage systems, and even soap-like substances, intestinal parasite loads in the Roman period did not drop compared to earlier, less sanitary societies. In some analyses, they appear to have stayed roughly the same or even increased in certain communities. How is that possible? Public latrines used shared water and shared sponges that could spread parasites between users rather than eliminating them. Roman farmers commonly used human waste as crop fertilizer, recycling parasite eggs directly back into the food supply. And Roman bathhouses, for all their engineering, were shared communal water that never got fully replaced, creating conditions where infection could spread quietly through hundreds of bathers a day. This is the first big twist, the one that flips the whole story on its head. You'd assume that more infrastructure automatically means more hygiene. It doesn't. Sanitation isn't just pipes and stone seats. It's understanding, at a level Roman engineers didn't have and couldn't have had, of how disease actually travels. They solved the visible problem, the smell, the mess, the inconvenience, while leaving the invisible one almost completely untouched. While Rome eventually crumbled in the West, a different center of the world kept refining hygiene in ways that rarely make it into the popular story. Across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cordoba, cities in the medieval period maintained bathhouses, running water systems, and a strong cultural emphasis on washing after using the toilet, generally using water rather than the dry methods common elsewhere at the time. Cities like Cordoba, under Islamic rule, are described by historians as having hundreds of public bathhouses and, by some accounts, more household access to running water than most of Europe would see again for centuries. Personal cleanliness after using the toilet was treated as a matter of religious practice as much as physical health, which meant hand washing and water use were built into daily routine rather than treated as optional extras. Why does this matter for the bigger story? Because it shows that the arc of sanitation history isn't one smooth, universal climb from primitive to modern. It's uneven. It moves in different directions in different places at the same time. While parts of post-Roman Europe were sliding backward toward chamber pots and open gutters, parts of the Islamic world were maintaining and even improving on the water-based hygiene infrastructure Rome had pioneered. There was never one single timeline of progress. There were many, running in parallel, some climbing while others stalled. So what happened in medieval Europe specifically? You might assume things simply got worse across the board, and in some very specific ways, they did, but not for the reasons most people guess. In medieval Europe, wealthier homes often had a small stone alcove built into an outer wall, called a garderobe, projecting slightly over a moat, a ditch, or simply open air below, so waste dropped straight down and away from the living space. It's a strange irony that some medieval castles thought of today as cold and primitive had a more direct waste disposal system than many crowded Roman apartment blocks. For everyone else, for the vast majority of medieval townspeople, the tools were simpler. A chamber pot kept in the bedroom, emptied by hand each morning, often straight out a window into the street below, a habit common enough in some cities that walking too close to a building at the wrong hour was a genuine, practical hazard. Someone had to deal with what accumulated in the streets and in the cesspits beneath homes, and that job had an actual name. In medieval and early modern England, workers who cleaned out cesspits and hauled away accumulated waste, usually at night, were called gong farmers. It was dirty, low status, and surprisingly well paid, because almost no one else wanted to do it. Waste collected this way was often called night soil, and in many places it was sold to farmers as fertilizer. The same basic strategy Roman farmers had used more than 1,000 years earlier, just with a new name attached. Picture a gong farmer at work in a London alley after dark, lantern in one hand, shovel in the other, climbing down into a brick-lined cesspit beneath someone else's home while the household sleeps upstairs. This was skilled, dangerous labor. Pits could collapse. Fumes could overwhelm a person working alone underground. It was, in its own unglamorous way, essential infrastructure, centuries before anyone thought to call it that. Now, here's a detail almost nobody knows, and it undercuts one of the most common myths about this whole subject. The flush toilet is not a Victorian invention, and it definitely wasn't invented by a man named Thomas Crapper, despite what you may have heard. In 1596, an English courtier named Sir John Harrington designed and built a working flush toilet with a valve to release water from a tank, installing one for himself and one for his godmother, Queen Elizabeth I. It was clever, it worked, and almost nobody adopted it, because there was still no sewer system underneath European cities capable of carrying the waste anywhere useful. A brilliant invention with absolutely nowhere to send its output. It took nearly 2 centuries for the idea to mature. In 1775, a watchmaker named Alexander Cumming patented the S-trap, a curved section of pipe that holds a small amount of water at all times, blocking sewer gas and smell from rising back up into the room. That single bend in a pipe is still sitting under your toilet right now, doing exactly the same job it did 250 years ago. Thomas Crapper, the name so many people associate with the toilet, was a real Victorian plumber and businessman who manufactured and popularized sanitary fittings later in the 1800s. But he didn't invent the flush toilet at all. He was a marketer riding 2 centuries of other people's engineering. For a few hundred years, this patchwork of chamber pots, cesspits, gong farmers, the occasional Harrington-style curiosity, and open gutters more or less held a growing Europe together. Then, cities got bigger, and the patchwork started to fail in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. By the middle of the 1800s, London had grown into one of the largest cities on Earth, and its waste system, still built largely on cesspits and open sewers, was collapsing under the weight of its own population. Raw sewage flowed into the River Thames. In the summer of 1858, the smell coming off the river became so overwhelming that it disrupted sessions of Parliament itself, an event that became known, quite literally, as the Great Stink. Curtains soaked in chemicals were hung in the windows of government buildings in a failed attempt to block the odor. It took a crisis that severe, one that personally inconvenienced the people in power, to finally force large-scale investment in a real, modern sewer system for the city. But the smell was never actually the real danger. That's the second twist, and it's an even bigger one than the Roman parasite problem. A few years earlier, in 1854, a London physician named John Snow investigated a severe cholera outbreak centered on Broad Street in the Soho district. At the time, the dominant medical theory blamed bad smells themselves, an idea called miasma theory, for spreading disease. Snow disagreed. He mapped every single case of cholera in the neighborhood by hand, marking each death on a street map, and found that they clustered overwhelmingly around one specific public water pump. He convinced local officials to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, and new infections in the area dropped sharply afterward. Snow's investigation became one of the founding moments of the entire field of epidemiology, the study of how disease spreads through populations. And it pointed towards something revolutionary. Contaminated water, not bad air, not moral failing, not smell, was the real killer. Sit with that for a second. Humans had been building latrines, sewers, bathhouses, and drainage systems for thousands of years, all of it aimed at solving a problem they could smell, while the actual killer was invisible, waterborne, and had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. It took John Snow, one stubborn doctor with a hand-drawn map, to finally start pointing everyone in the right direction, decades before germ theory was even widely accepted. The engineer who actually built London's answer was a man named Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the city's Metropolitan Board of Works. Following the Great Stink, Bazalgette designed and oversaw the construction of over 1,000 miles of new sewer tunnels beneath London, deliberately built far larger than the population of the time required, because he assumed correctly that the city would keep growing. Those same Bazalgette-era tunnels are still carrying part of London's waste today, more than a century and a half later. Once that piece finally clicked into place, everything moved fast by historical standards. Sewer systems started separating waste from drinking water, not just moving it out of smelling range. Cities began treating water before it reached people's homes, and the private enclosed single-purpose bathroom, the exact room you probably used this morning, spread rapidly through middle-class homes across Europe and North America over the following decades. Even something as small as toilet paper has its own surprisingly recent history. Commercially packaged toilet paper only became widely available in the late 1800s, and it wasn't until the early 1900s that companies like the Scott Paper Company helped turn it into a standard household product, rather than the newspaper, corn cobs, leaves, or, as you already learned, communal sponges that people had relied on for most of history. Indoor plumbing itself didn't become the default in ordinary American homes until well into the 20th century. Your grandparents, or your great-grandparents, may well have grown up using an outhouse. That's worth pausing on. This isn't ancient history in the way Çatalhöyük is ancient history. Widespread indoor plumbing, in much of the world, is barely 3 or 4 generations old. There's another thread worth pulling on here, because it reframes something you might take completely for granted: privacy itself. For nearly all of human history, privacy during bodily functions wasn't valued the way it is today, largely because privacy in general barely existed. People slept in shared spaces. They ate in shared spaces. They gave birth in shared spaces, with other women present, often the whole point. Isolation, The thing you might crave after a long day, the locked door, the quiet room, would have looked less like comfort and more like exile to most humans who ever lived. Solitude was rare, and it wasn't always something people wanted. Community was the default setting of being human, and that default extended into every corner of daily life, including the corners we now consider most private. So when did that change? The shift toward privacy tracks closely with the shift toward density, wealth, and eventually plumbing. As homes gained separate rooms, as cities gained infrastructure, as the middle class expanded in the 18th and 19th centuries, the bathroom slowly became its own private chamber. Something with a door, a lock, a specific and singular purpose. It's a remarkably recent invention. Most humans who have ever lived would not recognize the modern bathroom as a normal or necessary part of a house. To them, a room built for one specific bodily function, used by one person at a time, sealed off from the rest of family life, might look less like hygiene and more like strange, expensive isolation. Isn't it strange that something so ordinary to you would look almost luxurious, maybe even excessive, to nearly everyone who ever lived before the last 200 years? And it's worth remembering, even now, that this story isn't finished, and it isn't evenly distributed. Even today, billions of people around the world still lack access to a private, safe, sanitary toilet, relying instead on shared open or informal facilities not far removed in principle from a Çatalhöyük waste corner or a medieval cesspit. The private bathroom you use without a second thought is not a universal human standard. It's a privilege, unevenly distributed, still being built out in real time in many parts of the world right now, in this decade, while you read this sentence. Here's the reconstruction worth sitting with. All of it, laid end to end. A hunter-gatherer walks a few steps from camp at dawn, in view of the horizon, in view of anyone awake, and thinks nothing of it. A Neolithic farmer at Çatalhöyük steps carefully around a waste pit inside her own crowded home and has never known a cleaner alternative. A family in Mohenjo-daro uses a private latrine connected to a covered street drain. 4,500 years ago, quietly ahead of almost the entire rest of the world. A Roman citizen sits shoulder to shoulder with strangers on a stone bench, discussing politics, unaware that the shared sponge in his hand might be carrying the very sickness his elaborate city was supposedly built to prevent. A resident of medieval Cordoba washes with running water in a public bathhouse, generations ahead of much of the rest of Europe. A gong farmer climbs into a cesspit by lantern light beneath a sleeping London household, doing work nobody thanks him for. A Victorian doctor stands over a hand-drawn map covered in small black marks, staring at a single water pump, about to change the direction of public health forever. And an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette signs off on tunnels built decades ahead of the population that would need them, betting correctly on a future he would never fully see. 7 completely different solutions, separated by thousands of years, and every single one of them believed at the time that they had figured it out. You might believe the same thing about your own bathroom right now. And in a few hundred years, someone might look back at your locked door, your solitary confinement for something as basic as relief, and wonder why you found being alone so important, when for almost the entire span of human existence, no one ever needed to be. You wake up before the sun, and the first thing your body asks for isn't food. It's relief. No hallway, no door to lock. Just open ground, a horizon, and people nearby who understood exactly what you needed without a single word said. For most of human history, that was normal. It still is, if you go looking for it. It's only recently, blink of an eye recently, that we decided this most ordinary act needed a locked door, a curved pipe, a hand-drawn map, and 200 years of hard-won understanding to finally feel safe.